Hey guys, episode 5 of the Physico podcast today. We have representing Renaissance periodization, Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro. So welcome today and thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Now, today we're going to be talking all things gut health. So Gabrielle's actually coming out on June 25th with the Renaissance crew. She'll be speaking all things gut health, as we just mentioned. So today we're basically just going to go through and find out a little bit more about what we're going to be learning and hopefully dispel a few myths and facts for you all. So starting off, the number one question that we wanted to know from you was the gut being the second brain. Now, where did that come from and what are your thoughts on how all of that works?
Yeah, that's a great question. This actually was something that has been, we've had an awareness about kind of the gut-brain connection for decades. And early researchers and even caretakers of individuals who had a mental illness noted that there was a high prevalence of GI distress in individuals with diagnoses of things like depression and anxiety. And it appears that about 50% of those individuals do present with gastrointestinal distress or even irritable bowel syndrome. So there is definitely a link there. Now, the reason that people often say that the gut is the second brain is because just like our brain, the gut really has its own nervous system. So the brain and the spinal cord compose the central nervous system, and then the gut actually has what we call the enteric nervous system. So the brain and the gut are connected primarily through the vagus nerve, which controls our parasympathetic or rest and digest segment of the autonomic or kind of automatic nervous system. But the enteric nervous system of the gut actually can operate without input from the brain. So that controls things like the peristaltic contractions of the gut to move food through. And there's evidence too that it has its own pool of neurotransmitters and of hormones that can both have actions in the gut, in the digestive tract, and also perhaps in the brain. So we also know, based on rodent studies, that there is a link between gut function, the microbiome, and brain activity and behavior. That being said, the research there is extremely preliminary. We're still really, really early on. And I think it's important to note that we really weren't even able to characterize about 80% of the microbes that we can now until about 2002. Because before that, we were using just culture to identify, cell culture to identify those microbes. And about 80% of the microbes in our gut can't be cultured. So we were really working almost completely blind. So this area of research is still very new. And what we're doing with rodents is showing us some really compelling mechanistic data, but it's not really relatable to humans. So there are some significant limitations there. And actually, when you look at the data in humans, the actual control trials, like the primary literature, that's actually greatly outnumbered by the reviews in the field. So there are a ton of reviews based on just a paltry amount of evidence. So it might look like there's a lot of research, but it's not. It's just a lot of people who are sort of synthesizing the little bit of research out there and trying to come up with conclusions.
Okay. So in terms of that, you mentioned quickly the microbiome. So this is something that you speak about quite a lot. I've noticed through your other podcasts. This would be something that would be really good to just delve a little bit deeper into. So do you want to explain to everybody exactly what that is and what its functions are?
Absolutely. So humans, along with all animals, are inhabited by at least one microbiome. So the microbiome, it's actually used interchangeably with another term, the microbiota. So the microbiota refers to all of the microorganisms that, in this case, when we're talking about the gut, are inhabiting your digestive tract. The microbiome is all of those microorganisms and all of their genetic material. So the microbiota are made mostly of bacteria. It's about 99% bacteria, but we also have fungi, protists, archaea. We have some viruses in there. We have some bacteriophages, which are like viruses for bacteria. And it really is its own ecosystem with their surroundings, our gut, being the place that they live, just like we can think of, the rainforest being an ecosystem. There are a bunch of different organisms living in that rainforest, and they interact with their environment. So that's the same case with our microbiome. Those microbes interact with our intestinal cells and with other organs indirectly most of the time. So they play a role really in every facet of human physiology as far as we can tell, but we're still just kind of elucidating what that actually is, to what extent.
Okay, so that's going to end up being quite important. So the more research that is getting done on that. Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then in terms of going through now, we're seeing a lot of information in the last few years coming out on gut health. Now, a lot of it, if we look through your Instagram page, which is Vitamin PhD, we're seeing a lot of it being shown that it's not quite accurate, and then a lot of it is accurate. So what would you say would be the three biggest myths coming through on gut health that you've seen or you have to deal with on a daily basis talking with clientele?
That is such a great question. I would say the biggest myth, like the number one, is that we have control over all of those microbes. So people think that they can change their entire microbiome through exercise, through diet, through supplementation. And that is absolutely not the case. Based on research thus far with using dietary and exercise interventions, we sometimes see no changes at all, and sometimes we see changes that may correlate with a few taxa changing here and there. So perhaps 15 to 20% of our microbial diversity can be explained by both diet and exercise, respectively. So a combined total of maybe 30% based on really just a paucity of studies. It looks like the vast majority, sort of our core microbiome, stays very stable throughout adulthood, even after perturbation like antibiotic use. In some cases, people bounce back after just a few days. It's not always the case, but even so, it's just that, even if we have really, really significant dietary changes, we go from, being carnivore to vegan, yeah, you will see changes, but you are not going to restore or renovate the entire microbiome. So that's really number one. Number two would be the idea that there is a profile of healthy or unhealthy gut bacteria. When you look at healthy controls that have been characterized in Korea versus Japan versus North America versus West Africa, the healthy controls are all considered to be healthy, free of disease, but they're significantly different. So they don't cluster together on a graph. So there's really no profile of a person being healthy or likewise unhealthy. So the term that we use for sort of unhealthy gut is dysbiosis. And that means that there is an unfavorable relative abundance of species. But even though we do see that dysbiosis is a trend in various disease states, such as autoimmune diseases, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, all of those profiles of dysbiosis also look different. And even when we pare down and look at the same disease, perhaps looking at individuals who have depression, we do see that they look different from the controls, but they still also look different from one another. So in saying something like, oh, we can kill the bad bugs and just promote growth of the good bugs, well, no, I would say that goes into like myth number 3, that it's not about a specific bad bug or good bug. It's about the relative abundance of those microbes. And sometimes a bad guy is just sort of an unpleasant guy, but he's actually combating with a really, really bad guy. And so he actually is protective. So it really is nuanced, and there's a lot of context there. And when we look at, who's a bad guy versus a good guy, we have to get very, very specific. We have to look at specific strains. I think people might be surprised that there are probiotic strains of E. coli, because he's always counted as sort of a bad guy, but that's really not the case. So I think it just all goes to show that this area is so complex and so nuanced, and that if someone is saying that they have a plan for you to completely restore or renovate your gut or heal your gut, that's really not the case. Now, can we restore normal function? Can we alleviate symptoms and gastric distress? Absolutely. But we can't make claims about really, really changing the microbiome or really, really healing the gut, because we just don't have the evidence that that is occurring.
Okay. So and I'm not sure how this is over in Atlanta, but in Perth, there's a huge rush of people going out and buying the kombucha drinks and things like that for gut restoring. So that sort of would tie into that and saying it's probably a bit of a myth.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with those products that are considered to be probiotic. That word really is kind of abused. Probiotic has to be an organism that has been shown to confer benefit to the host. And not just that, but really we need our probiotics to be effectively dosed, and their effects are really disease specific. And I would also venture to say that the presence of one randomized control trial showing that a probiotic had an effect isn't really proof of efficacy, that we actually need a breadth and a depth of research to show that consistently it provides a benefit.
Yeah.
When we're looking at things like fermented dairy or kombucha, we don't know exactly what strains are present. We don't know in the amounts. And then if there's no enteric coating, they probably won't survive transit through the stomach.
Okay, cool. So there you have it for kombucha. We're on a negatory. I did actually have one question that was asked by me on an Instagram post that I also wanted to run by you as well, obviously, just because I know nothing about this topic. So they had asked about the benefits of collagen protein and if it was better for you than whey protein. So what would your thoughts be? Sorry.
Collagen protein.
Yes.
It's another one that is really popular right now.
Yeah.
Now, there are some studies that show that collagen protein supplementation, specific forms like UC2 collagen, hydrolyzed collagen, may help to alleviate osteoarthritic joint pain in elderly adults, with the caveat that they quite often do also have a protein deficiency. So perhaps they have some deficiency and the collagen is helping to supply glycine that perhaps they weren't receiving, although there's really no evidence for that. It's just a postulation, and there's really not a lot of support in the literature, because there's plenty of evidence, not just it's not just an absence of evidence, it's just evidence of an absence of effect. So the problem with collagen protein is that it is really lacking in the essential amino acids. It's primarily glycine. It's a structural protein, so it's poorly digested, not very bioavailable, and really doesn't give us anything that we need for tissue repair. So it's become very popularized for use for gut health, and in that case, there's really both evidence. There's a lack of evidence that it would have any effect, but also really no physiological basis for what effect it might even have. So it doesn't contain amino acids that would be especially helpful to the colonocytes or the intestinal cells. Certainly, intake of extra amino acids will promote the growth of certain bacteria that like to metabolize them, just like any increase in dietary protein. And that's about it. It is really just it's really expensive and not beneficial, and certainly not better than whey, because whey is very high in leucine, and if you get a whey isolate, there's not going to be any lactose in there that can cause gastric upset. Really high protein quality. So if you're going to pick between those two post-workout, absolutely go for the whey protein.
Okay, cool. And with that being said, we've gone through a fair few of the myths here. Now, if somebody was trying to improve their overall health, overall gut health, what would be your 3 tips for them to actually be able to improve their gut health or overall health?
Yeah, this is my super unsexy, unexciting answer. It's to eat plants at every meal, and that's fruits, vegetables, whole grains, to ensure that you're getting sufficient fiber, which is about 25 to 40 grams per day. Get sufficient sleep, and exercise. Not too much exercise in the hot heat. And if you have to do that, make sure you're hydrating properly. And really, kind of just avoid the obvious things like smoking, excessive alcohol intake, and try to maintain a healthy weight. The biggest factors in shaping the microbiome would be things like your geographic location, your age, and your gender. You can't really control those things. But the next big thing really would be habitual diet. And it looks like in terms of supporting more microbial diversity, which is generally recognized as a good thing, the best thing that you can do for that really is to eat a wide variety of plants. You don't have to have a vegan or vegetarian diet. You can be omnivorous, certainly, but making sure that you're taking in plants at every meal. And that's really as basic as it gets. I mean, there's
cool.
no magic pill, nothing super special, but plants at every meal.
Plants at every meal. That's something I'm going to have to work on as well then. Just as a final question as well, we actually had one more just come through now, which was your thoughts with FODMAP diets, when to use them. This person had particularly wrote that are they being overused nowadays with people? So what would your thoughts be on that?
That is a great question. FODMAP diets, like any elimination diet, they're meant to be a temporary intervention that, in this case, removes fermentable fibers for a short period of time in order to then test through reintroduction to determine the types of fibers you can tolerate and also the amounts of those fibers and saccharides, so just carbohydrates in general. So some of these carbohydrates, if we lack the enzymes to break them down, the bacteria will instead, and then that leads to gas production. So they're really beneficial fibers because they help to support a diverse microbiome. So we want to have them in the diet as much as we can while still avoiding gastric upset. So where I see them being overused is not really in their implementation, but in the incorrect implementation where people stay on the elimination phase forever and don't ever reintroduce anything. That can lead to issues. So I do have clients use that with great success, but the elimination phase is short, and then we get to reintroduction and help them determine what foods digest well for them.
So I've heard with the elimination diet around 90 days. Is that correct, or too long, too short?
It's usually, that would be pretty long. The elimination phase itself, where you're actually eating a very low FODMAP diet, is recommended to be about 2 to 6 weeks.
Okay.
But really, you kind of wait until your symptoms have stabilized, so you're feeling good, not as much bloating, bowel movements are comfortable, not as gassy, and then you can start with the reintroduction. And that can last several weeks, depending on how you implement reintroduction.
Okay. And would you implement sort of one food at a time to eliminate the other variables to know if, yeah, okay, cool. All right, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not so much one food at a time, but it's one primary group at a time. So you usually start with the simple saccharides, like one of the first tests is usually fructose. Okay. And then you might move on to lactose, and then you move on to some of the more complex structures like the galacto-oligosaccharides and things like that. So you kind of go from simplest to more complex, and then you kind of pick a food that's most representative of that group. And I will say that because this is fairly new, this was developed by Monash University, but there are a lot of different iterations that we don't have a best evidence-based way of implementing yet because we don't have any testing showing that like one way is necessarily better than the other. So I basically, I implement ways based on Monash and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is the accrediting body for dietitians here.
Okay, cool. There you go. We all learned something there on that. Now, Gabrielle will be in Perth on June 25th. She will be speaking at the Renaissance Periodization Seminar at the Physique Code, as we said. She'll be going through a whole range of topics. Do you want to just run us through the sort of topics that we're going to go through and what they involved in regarding to today, and then we can let you get back to work.
Yeah. Yeah, so the topics that I've been covering quite a lot lately that I'm really super passionate about would be the diet and diet as it relates to the gut microbiome. So I'm primarily looking at our macronutrients, so how the bacteria and other organisms interact with those and how they can influence the shape of the microbiome. And then also the microbiome and exercise, which is a really, really new area. We have really just a handful of studies. You can probably count them on two hands. What we have in humans. So looking at how exercise shapes the microbiome and then how the microbiome sort of correlates with physical fitness.
Okay, cool. That's going to be exciting. There's going to be a whole bunch of new topics that I think the majority in Perth won't have heard before. So that'll be really exciting.
That's awesome.
And you will also be the first person in our gym that is from Michigan. So.
That's so cool. Yeah. Michigan and then Virginia. So I guess now it's almost half my life has been in Michigan and half has been out of it, but still my hometown.
But you're not a Michigan supporter, so.
No, you know what? It's funny. I actually was thinking I was going to go to MSU. So.
Well, you're allowed in the gym then.
Oh, okay.
As a Buckeye supporter. Okay, cool. Thank you so much for coming on today. And I know you're super busy and we really appreciate that. And everybody's going to be super excited to see you. And I think the Quackers will too. So we can't wait to have you in Perth. And thank you again for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We'll see you June 25th.